Hello, this is Chuck Ridgway, Automation Technology Manager at Horner. Thanks for joining us for another Tuesday live stream. Here's our topic for today: using two Ethernet ports on the XL Prime. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with XL Prime, you can think of it as an internal upgrade or an update to our most popular OCS All-in-one controller series, the XL series. I say it's an internal update because of the fact that from the outside, nothing seems to have changed. But on the inside, we've upgraded the microprocessor, improving performance and component availability, which is important these days. We've also modernized the internal memory structure, eliminating rechargeable batteries. Now that's important because rechargeable batteries are the limiting factor when it comes to long-term memory integrity, especially in wide temperature environments. But today isn't strictly about XL Prime. It is specifically about using dual Ethernet with XL Prime. Let's break down today's topic. We're going to start by talking about why is dual Ethernet an advantage? Why do OEM customers like it so much? We're going to talk about how dual Ethernet was implemented on the XL series, and then examine how we've had to implement it on the XL Prime series. How does that impact installation? How does that impact configuration and programming? Let's get started. First of all, let's talk about why is dual Ethernet such an advantage for an OEM machine builder. Well, first of all, it gives the OEM the ability to have a dedicated machine network on their machine where any I/O or drives or any peripherals at all that need to talk Ethernet protocols can talk directly to their OCS controller and guarantee that none of that equipment is going to have to interact with plant equipment. That's because there's a second dedicated Ethernet port that they can hand over to their end manufacturer customers, so their customers can add the SCADA system or ERP system or whatever it may be that their customer wants to connect to the machine. So the customer's IT department is comfortable because they know they're not going to interact with any of the machine equipment, and vice versa. You're comfortable because of the same reason. Okay, so as you can see, it's a big advantage to have dual Ethernet capability. Now let's take a look at how we implemented dual Ethernet on our XL series, which is currently our most popular series. And two of the most popular units with this capability are the XL7 and the EXL10. The XL15 Plus also has this capability. So let's first talk about physical installation. When you look at the XL7 and the EXL10, you'll notice that there are two physical ports right next to each other on the back of the unit. So we've got this kind of lower rear view here where we can see those two ports. Now keep in mind, each of these ports is completely independent. They're not based on some sort of internal Ethernet switch circuitry. These are two separate Ethernet adapters. Now as you look at this graphic, you'll notice LAN 2 is on the left and LAN 1 is on the right. Of course, the units are silkscreen, so you can see that if you have a unit in front of you. But once again, two completely separate Ethernet ports. Now from a configuration standpoint, there's a lot of things you can do with dual Ethernet. First, let's start by talking about the fact that, of course, you can program from Cscape over Ethernet. That's something you've got the capability of doing. And also, you can add I/O over Ethernet as well. Smart Rail Ethernet being an example of that. But one of the more popular things that you can do with Ethernet is protocol communication, and we'll get to that here in a minute. Before we can get that far, though, we need to make sure that each of the two ports that we are configuring are on a separate subnet. So how do we do that? Well, you'll notice when you go to hardware configuration, if you've selected an OCS model that supports two Ethernet ports, you'll notice both LAN 1 and LAN 2 are listed, and they each have a config button that you can press. And when you go in individually to each of these ports, that's where you have access to configure the IP address, the net mask, the gateway, etc. So at that point, you can be sure or ensure that through your configuration that the two ports are on separate subnets. That's important for proper operation. Now, getting back to some of the most popular tasks that customers want to perform using Ethernet on their OCSs, and that is they want to communicate with other industrial devices. Now, we've got a couple different classifications of protocols that our customers can use towards that goal. First, we have what we call resident protocols. What is a resident protocol? Well, a resident protocol is embedded in the OCS firmware. So it really just needs to be enabled in Cscape with maybe a little bit of configuration information, and then the OCS will be ready to execute that protocol without a lot of effort. Okay? Now, for the small amount of extra configuration that might be required for any given protocol, you simply select that protocol and then press the Configure Selected Protocol button in order to make that happen. Now, the types of protocols that are resident protocols in the OCS, those include Modbus TCP server, Ethernet IP I/O adapter, Ethernet global data, FTP for file transfers, NTP for calibrating or synchronizing the clock of the OCS with a network time server, maybe even one from the US standards or NIST, and then also the server version of ASCII over TCP/IP. Now, one thing you'll notice, one protocol you'll notice on the list that you need to be careful with is HTTP web server. Now, this is not WebMI support. This is legacy HTTP version 1.1, I believe, that's been in our products and available for 10 plus years. But unless you're a customer who's been using it for that long with a legacy implementation, more than likely you want to leave HTTP web server unchecked, because if it's checked, WebMI will not work. Now, in addition to resident protocols, the OCS also supports what's called downloadable protocols. And these protocols aren't completely embedded in firmware. As a matter of fact, there's extra information at download time, kind of the firmware details, that have to be downloaded between Cscape and the OCS controller. And to make this happen, there's actually a DLL file for each of these downloadable protocols, most of which are installed in the Cscape install. But it's feasible that you could have a special downloadable protocol that you receive from Horner or download separately from the Cscape install. And in that case, you're going to need to make sure that the DLL file finds its way into the Cscape Ethernet protocols folder. Once you've done that, then the next time you actually select or take a look at the list of available downloadable protocols, you should see your protocol on the list. But again, most of those protocols you see here on the screen, if not all of them, are installed right with Cscape. And there's a lot of popular downloadable protocols as well. Modbus TCP client, Ethernet IP, Logix tag exchange, where you exchange tag data with a Rockwell Logix CPU, BACnet IP, which has become a very popular protocol in building automation, and then of course the client version of ASCII over TCP IP. Now, if you have any extra interest in any of these protocols, whether they're the resident protocols or the downloadable protocols, keep in mind that on our YouTube channel, we've got videos on basically all of these protocols, I believe. Okay, so we've talked about programming over Ethernet from Cscape. We've talked about adding I/O through maybe SmartRail or something over Ethernet. We've also talked about different protocols that you can use over Ethernet. Now, what's the difference between LAN 1 and LAN 2 in terms of which of these tasks you can perform on which port? Well, the reality is, and it's good news, is you can perform any of these tasks on both ports. So again, you can have I/O on both ports, you can program over Cscape on both ports if you need to, or you can have different protocols or some of the same protocols running on both ports. It really depends on what you need. Now, again, getting back to our first slide, what's going to happen a lot of the time is you're probably going to be doing all kinds of machine tasks on LAN 1, and you're probably going to be leaving LAN 2 to your customer, and you might be doing things on LAN 2 like enabling Modbus TCP server, enabling Ethernet IP I/O adapter, those sorts of things to allow data access of your machine to your customer. But there's no significant difference between port 1 and port 2. Now, that wasn't true when we first released two-port OCS models, But over the years, we've actually gotten to the point where now both ports, for all intents and purposes, are just about equal. Now we're going to pivot and talk about how we've implemented dual Ethernet on XL Prime. Everything up till now, we've just been talking about dual Ethernet in general, or some specifics when it comes to the XL series. But now we've got to talk about how we implemented Ethernet on the XL Prime in an environment where it's difficult to get a lot of components, including Ethernet chips. Those are a big problem these days. So the chips we wanted to use to be able to embed a second LAN port directly in the motherboard or on the motherboard of the XL Prime, they just weren't available. So we had a couple of choices. One, we could wait for the chips to be available. Now that could have meant delaying XL Prime for months or maybe even a year, who knows? That really didn't sound like a good idea. Another option was just not make that second port available at all and make the XL7 Prime and the EXL10 Prime a single port Ethernet product. Well, that's not good either, because let's face it, having those two Ethernet ports is a big deal for OEMs. So we finally settled upon a third option, and that is we're including in the box a USB to Ethernet adapter that can be plugged into the USB port on the back of the XL7 Prime or EXL10 Prime that will allow and provide that LAN 2 functionality. Okay, and there's no special drivers that are required or anything like that. It's literally just a question of plugging that adapter into the USB port on the back of the XL Prime. Now, there's got to be some negative impact from that, right? So let's talk about some of the potential negative impacts of connecting Ethernet to an adapter versus directly into the unit itself. Oh, and one more thing I wanted to mention. Let me go back a slide. And that is that the second LAN connector is still stuffed on the motherboard of the XL Prime, but it's not functional. Okay, so be aware of that. You're still going to see two connectors, two Ethernet connectors on the XL Prime, but the second one is non-functional. In order to get LAN 2 functionality, you have to use the adapter. Okay, now returning to what are the potential issues we could face, that we might anticipate with an adapter type scenario. Well, the first thought might be, well, how secure does that adapter actually plug into that port anyway? Because if it falls out, now suddenly I don't have Ethernet capability. That's bad, obviously. But keep this in mind. All the USB ports used on OCS are special high retention USB ports. That's true for both the USB-A port and the Mini-B port for programming. So these high retention ports meet all Class 1 Division 2 standards for operation from UL. So that means UL is extremely confident that these ports are going to hold whatever's plugged into them and not allow it to fall out and cause some sort of a spark. So that means you can rest easy that the USB to Ethernet adapter isn't going to come loose either. And you'll find that as soon as you plug that in, it's held extremely securely. Now, the next thing you might think is, well, with that extra bulk of the adapter, I might have to do something special when it comes to dressing up the cabling and all that at the back of the XL7 Prime or XL10 Prime, but that's not an issue either. That adapter has a very low mass, and it's really just like dressing a regular Ethernet cable. So that's definitely not a problem. What about performance? USB isn't as fast as gigabit Ethernet, for instance, so is that going to be a problem? Well, keep in mind, very, very few industrial Ethernet applications are designed to take advantage of the extra bandwidth and the extra speed of gigabit Ethernet. So in reality, because of the types of protocols that we're using here, let's face it, we're not streaming video or anything over these Ethernet connections. The fact that you're going to have a USB 2.0 interface in between the OCS and the Ethernet network, it has no impact whatsoever on the throughput. So that's definitely not an issue. Good news there. What about functionality or configuration? Functionally, is the fact that we're using an adapter on LAN 2, is that going to reduce what we can do on that port? Is it going to change any of the configuration requirements? So if we have an XL7 or an EXL10 that we want to upgrade to Prime, are we going to have to make programming changes in order to adapt to this adapter on the Prime? The answer again, no, definitely not. No impact whatsoever, no functional changes, no configuration changes as well. Now, there is one potential impact that you do need to keep in mind, and that is this. If you're already utilizing the USB-A port on your existing application, say with an XL7 or an EXL10, if you're utilizing that USB port and now suddenly you want to also plug in another USB device, in other words, this adapter, now you need to take a look at maybe implementing a USB hub, because you can plug in a USB hub to the OCS USB port, and now you've got multiple USB ports that you can use to plug in multiple devices. So not only the Ethernet adapter, but maybe a USB flash drive or a USB camera or a Horner USB to Wi-Fi adapter. So if you are already using that USB port in your application and you want to upgrade to Prime, then you might want to consider a USB hub. That's a real potential impact or potential adjustment you'll need to make in your system, possibly. Oh, and specifically, Horner has tested the Realtek 5411 chipset, which is available in a lot of different USB hubs, to ensure there won't be any compatibility issues or any of those sorts of things. Okay, so that is really all the material I wanted to cover with you today. So let's do a quick wrap up. I encourage you to take advantage of dual Ethernet capability if you haven't done so already. If you're an OEM machine builder, it's going to allow you to have a completely functional, completely isolated machine LAN that you don't have to worry might get stepped on by your customer's plant network. So that's a big deal. I would definitely consider taking advantage of that. Also, we covered the fact that due to component shortages, for XL Prime, we're going to have to use a USB to Ethernet adapter that's included in the box to provide that LAN 2 connectivity. But the good news is this does not significantly impact installation, configuration, performance, or your application program whatsoever. The only potential impact is if you're already using that USB port, you might want to consider a USB hub so you can have multiple USB devices connected to your OCS. Okay, I do want to remind you that we're here every Tuesday at 2 o'clock Eastern. If you watch us live, you'll have the opportunity to post comments or to ask questions in the chat section, and we've always got folks standing by to answer those questions or comments in that section. If you're watching on replay like a lot of our customers do, then of course we still want your comments and your questions. Just give those to us in the comment section and we'll respond just as soon as we can. Next week, we think we've got a bit of good content for you. Next week, I'm going to be at the WEFTech show in New Orleans, and we're going to be showing off several new Horner solutions. Remember, Horner solutions are packaged products which don't require any Seascape programming whatsoever, but basically are ready to install and use right out of the gate. So we'll be showing some new solutions from Horner Solutions down there at WEFTech. Now, I'm not sure, I don't think it's going to be a live show, but we're certainly going to record from the show floor. We're going to show you demonstrations of those new products, give you a little bit of flavor for New Orleans. It should be a good show. Now, before I wrap up, I do want to encourage you to go ahead and subscribe to our channel if you haven't done so already. It doesn't cost anything. And if you choose notifications when you subscribe, then you'll be notified every time we go live or every time we post a new video. And we've been working really hard to provide lots of good video content this year. Okay, so until next week when I see you from WEFTech, in the meantime, let's all go out there and let's do us some good.